The Mistletoe Game by Bree Livingston. Copyright 2018. Chapter 1. With a flick of his wrist, Bryce Foster closed the door to his office and the Christmas music pumping throughout the office building's speakers and paused to bask in the silence of his workspace. He loved Christmas, but Thanksgiving had just ended a little over 2 weeks ago. He'd barely digested his turkey and gravy, and his holly already had enough jolly. Why did it seem as though Christmas came earlier and earlier every year? His office door cracked open, and he glanced up to find his best friend, Cliff Rustin, poking his head in the door. Bryce sighed. What if I was making out with someone? Cliff pushed the rest of the way through and paused, lifting a single eyebrow. Really? It's possible, you know. I do date. Taking your cousin to your sister's wedding doesn't qualify it as dating, Cliff said as he took a seat facing Bryce. Bryce rolled his eyes. Cut that out. I didn't take my cousin. I took Regina from Human Resources. Who you said felt more like a relative than a possible romantic connection. Cliff crossed his arms over his chest. I don't understand why you don't ask Savannah out. Why? We work on campaigns together. In fact, we're presenting our pitch tomorrow to Simon's Simple Sugar Confections. Cliff nodded. Is that why you're still here after everyone else has gone home? Yeah, Bryce said, taking a glance at the falling snow outside his third-floor office. One of the reasons he'd stayed in Nashville after he graduated from Vanderbilt was the snow and rolling hills. The city was beautiful and full of life, music, and culture. Where is Savannah? Where? The reason Bryce never asked her out. She's on a date. He hoped the guy she was out with knew how lucky he was. Savannah Hayes was the most beautiful woman Bryce had ever laid eyes on. At 30, 3 years younger than him, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and the cutest sprinkling of freckles across her cheeks and nose. And she wasn't just beautiful, she was gracious, caring, and kind. A true, giving soul who gave Bryce butterflies every time he saw her. A date? But she likes you just as much as you like her. Yeah, right. Cliff always saw things that weren't there. Just because Savannah was sweet didn't mean she had romantic feelings towards Bryce. She does not. We're coworkers. Bryce leaned back in his chair and tapped his pencil on his desktop. Besides, office romances don't work. We have a good relationship, and I don't want to mess that up. And he definitely didn't want to mess anything up with Savannah. They'd been working together successfully for a year. From the moment they were paired up, they'd clicked, and working with her was as easy as breathing. Chicken. Bryce scoffed. Don't start. Bwack, bwack, bwack. You're so childish. Cliff chuckled. Yeah, but it's fun to rib you. You make it so easy. Grow up, Bryce said with a smile. Bryce, you need more than successful campaigns and long wishful glances at Savannah. You need to go out. Have fun. The problem was, he didn't want to go out. Not with just anyone. It was so stupid, but lately, he couldn't picture spending time with anyone but Savannah. He tried going out several times, only to end the date wishing the person he was out with was her. I have fun. No, you don't, but you will. You only have a month until that vacation. Maybe you'll have a serendipitous meeting with your soulmate in Puerto Rico. Great. Now Cliff would give him grief about that too. Bryce groaned. I can't go. Cliff's face scrunched up. What? You've been looking forward to that vacation all year. Why? Bryce shrugged. I gave the money to the community center. You gave them more than $5,000? Are you insane? They needed it. The roof needs to be replaced, and you know what happened. That new payroll manager they hired didn't pay the insurance. The building inspector was going to close the place down if the roof didn't get done. Shaking his head, Cliff sighed. I get that, but, man, you have to think of yourself sometimes. Bryce just couldn't. Not when he knew how important it was for the kids. Plus, being the basketball coach meant a lot to him. He loved those kids. I couldn't go while knowing the center would suffer because of it. The after-school program is more important to me than Puerto Rico. It's not like the place is going anywhere. There's always next year. And the community will need something else, Cliff said and stood. You're too nice. One of these days, you need to put yourself first. He walked to the door and paused. Don't stay too late. Don't want to have raccoon eyes during that presentation tomorrow, right? I won't. I'm just double-checking things, and then I'll go home. All right, I'll see you tomorrow. I'd say good luck, but we both know you don't need it. You and Savannah always get the client. Thanks. Bryce smiled. It was true, and he was pretty sure their boss and owner of the firm, Victoria Wallace, would be pretty pleased when they landed Simon's Simple Sugar Confections, the largest bakery on the East Coast. Most likely, Victoria was already planning the celebration party for the next evening. Cliff gave a tiny salute, leaving Bryce alone once again. He leaned his head back against the chair and stared out the window, letting the falling snow blur as he wondered how Savannah's date was going and wishing he was the one making her smile, causing that little dimple on her right cheek to deepen. With a shake of his head, the thoughts scattered. His partnership with Savannah meant more to him than a few dates. What if something went wrong? Would they still be able to work together? It wasn't worth the risk. No, it was better to just forget it. But as much as his head understood the sound reasoning, it didn't stop his heart from wondering what if.
Chapter 2. Hey, sweetheart, Paul said to the waitress who stopped at their table. We'll take a bottle of the house wine. Okay? Savannah Hayes stared at the man across from her. What on earth had Gail been thinking when she set this date up? Paul Peterman was good-looking, but good grief and gravy, he was awful. I'll just have water, Savannah said. I'm not much of a drinker. Oh, one of them, Paul replied. Savannah lifted an eyebrow. One of them? A stick in the mud. Her patience was already beginning to wane. I'm not a stick in the mud. I just don't drink. If you want wine, then have wine. The waitress shifted from one foot to the other, no doubt feeling the uncomfortable tension that had been plaguing Savannah and Paul since he'd pulled in front of her townhome and honked. Bryce would never have done that or called her a stick in the mud. He respected that she didn't drink. Plus, he would have gotten out of the car, come to the door, and knocked like a gentleman. Savannah knew this because he did it when he'd pick her up for work from time to time. If only she were on a date with him instead of the goober sitting across from her. Her friend and coworker Gail Bailey, the office receptionist, had set this date up, and it was going to be the last one, too. That was the only reason Savannah had agreed to go out with Paul in the first place. No more setups. Paul rolled his eyes. Whatever. Look, just bring the bottle and a single glass. The waitress nodded. Yes, sir. Once the waitress was out of earshot, Savannah leaned forward. I'm not a stick in the mud. I lost my best friend to a drunk driver when I was a kid. I haven't been able to even touch the stuff because of it. Okay. Whatever. What was this guy's problem? It was almost as if he didn't want to be on a date. Maybe this date was a bad idea. I'd say. Gail said you were a looker, but I think we have different ideas about what that means. Savannah stared at him in disbelief. There was honesty, and then there was rude. This guy had zipped right past rude into jerk. You realize you said that aloud, right?
Yeah.
So? I think it's better to be open and upfront. That way, no one is disappointed. Honesty and speaking your mind are qualities I admire. For a split second, Savannah was dumbfounded. Okay, you want open, upfront honesty? Fine. A rusty spoon to the eye would be more pleasant than you. She stood, gathering her purse and coat as she did. You're causing a scene. And it'll be a bigger one if I stay, because there's a good chance I'll end up decking you. She whirled on her heels and marched to the front door. As soon as she stepped into the cold night air, she hit Gail's number on her phone and put it to her ear. "Savannah?" Gail answered. "Where are you?" "The usual, but why? Aren't you on a date with Paul?" "I'd rather eat spam with red relish than ever see that man again." And Gail knew how much she hated both of those things. "He was that bad?" Savannah snorted. "That bad? You assume there was anything good to start with. What a jerk." "Look, I know you mean well, but I'm not letting you set me up anymore. Come on over to the house, and we'll talk." "Fine," Savannah said and ended the call. A half hour later, the Uber she called stopped in front of Gail's home. After tipping him, she stepped out and stood facing the home donned in Christmas lights with a tree twinkling in the front window. This is what Savannah wanted. Well, not just the lights. She wanted a family with a house and kids and a reason to put up all those lights. She walked to the door, and before she could knock, Gail swung it open. "Hey. Hey. Where's Jerome and Henry?" Jerome took Henry to ride the Polar Express.
Aww.
"That was sweet," Savannah said as she stepped inside. "I bet they'll love it." Gail nodded. "Oh, they will." Henry was literally dancing from the door to the car when his dad surprised him tonight. Savannah followed her into the kitchen and sat at the table, draping her coat across the back of the chair. "Okay, so spill what happened," Gail said. "Paul Peterman is a jerk. He honked at me." "Honked? So, it was a quirk. You could have said you don't like that." Savannah shook her head. "He said that your definition of a looker differed from his and that he believed in being open and honest. He's lucky I didn't punch him." "Why did you set me up with him?" Gail shrugged. "He didn't seem that bad." "Well, he was. Or you were just comparing him to Bryce." Savannah groaned. "Not this again." Gail was convinced Bryce liked Savannah, but Gail didn't understand. Bryce was her partner and friend. They were a great team, and he was a sweet guy. That didn't mean they would or could be an item. I wasn't comparing them. At least, not out loud. Gail narrowed her eyes. "Yes, you were." "No, boy, that was flimsy. Why don't you just go out with Bryce?" "Why?" "Because he'd never asked, and they were co-workers. She couldn't jeopardize their working relationship. We work together. You know that. We make a great team, and we're just friends." Gail crossed her arms over her chest. "Girl, you have liked that man since the moment you were paired up. You can't lie to me. I see it. Everyone in the office sees that the two of you are perfect for each other." Savannah groaned. "Then all of you need your eyes checked. We're partners. That's it." Inwardly, she wanted the rumors to be true. To have a chance with him. She was so attracted to him and his personality. In the past year, she'd learned so many great things about him. He was funny, genuine, caring, and giving. As far as looks went, he was near perfect in her opinion. She loved his shaggy brown hair, puppy dog brown eyes, and smile that wasn't picture perfect. He'd been in a fight as a teenager, and his tooth was knocked out. The repair hadn't been the best, but he'd kept it to remind himself that violence was never the answer. Like she said, though, they were coworkers and successful. Putting their careers at risk didn't seem the smart way to go, but her heart didn't seem to be on the same page any longer. The more time she spent with Bryce, the more she was willing to risk anything to have a chance at a future with him. Chapter 3. Without even looking up, Savannah knew who had just breezed into her office. Bryce was wearing her favorite cologne. Or was it just aftershave? She'd been to his home once or twice when they were working on a campaign, and she'd never seen a cologne bottle. Not that she'd been snooping, but she hadn't noticed any bottles on her trips to the bathroom. "You ready?" he asked. Savannah lifted her head, and her gaze fell on him. Wow. Every time she saw him, she got butterflies. Lately, it was as though a million of them had decided to take up residence in her stomach. She'd become so jittery around him at times, especially when he'd catch her staring at him. There were only so many times a bird could be flying outside his window. "I'm ready." "Is that a new suit?" she asked. "No, but I think that's a new dress." He was always the first person to notice anything new. "It is. I wanted to wow them." "You could wear anything and do that. Just flash that brilliant smile, and they won't even care about the presentation." Savannah waved him off. "Oh, stop." He was so sweet and complimentary. But that was him. It was who he was. "I'm serious. I think that's why we land so many clients." Savannah walked around her desk and stopped in front of him to straighten his tie. "And I think it's you with your out-of-this-world charm." Bryce chuckled. "Charm?
Nah.
Oh,
Yeah.
you ooze it." "I don't." She caught her bottom lip between her teeth. "That right there, too. So humble." Shaking his head, his lips twitched up. She loved it when he blushed, especially when she complimented him. He pushed her hair over her shoulder and ran his hand down her arm, leaving a trail of goosebumps. "I only look good because of you." "Oh really?" He locked eyes with her. "Absolutely. You're funny, intelligent, poised, and creative." This compliment felt different. The words were the same as usual, but it felt like there was more behind it. She wasn't sure if it was the way he was holding her gaze or the way his voice had lowered, but she suddenly felt tingly, and those butterflies were going nuts. "Thank you. Savannah, you're..." "Hey." Gail's voice broke the moment. "You two have 5 minutes to get to the conference room." Inwardly, Savannah screamed. What was Bryce about to say? Would it seem like she was desperate if she asked? Or was he just going to say she needed a breath mint? This was why crushing on a coworker was a bad idea. It gave a person all sorts of funny ideas, and it made them crazy. Bryce jerked his hand from her arm and stepped back. "Game face. We can do this." Savannah smiled. "Yep, we can do this." She snagged their image boards and followed him out of the office to the conference room. Victoria stood at the door, waiting for them. "Please tell me my star team is ready to land this account." Bryce nodded. "We're more than ready. I think this is the best campaign we've ever come up with, and it was Savannah's idea." "It was not," Savannah said, smiling as she playfully popped him on the arm. Why did he always give her the credit? He was just as creative and clever. Sometimes more so. What made them work was how well they complemented each other. When one of them was having an off moment, the other rode into the rescue. "We both came up with the concept." Victoria grinned. "I love you too. You work so well together. If everyone worked as well as you two, we'd own this city." Bryce shrugged. Give it time. We've only been working together a year. Another 5 or so years, and we will. Okay, go in there and dazzle Simon Granger." "We'll do our best," Savannah said.
Chapter 4. A Toast. Victoria raised her glass. To a successful pitch, a new client, and, most of all, a fantastically successful year. She smiled as she looked from Bryce to Savannah. "And to you too. Thank you for all your hard work." Once again, Bryce and Savannah had swung a home run pitch, and they'd landed Simon's. And as per usual, the entire office, roughly 100 people, was celebrating their win with Victoria leading the congratulations. Bryce often wondered if it would get old, but he suspected it would take at least a few decades for that to happen. Both of them lifted their glass. To a successful year, Bryce said as he leaned in. And to an incredible partner. Savannah's cheeks turned poinsettia red. Man, he loved it when she blushed. Her creamy skin would turn pink and highlight her high cheekbones. Those dark blue eyes of hers would twinkle, and then she'd capture her bottom lip between her teeth, bringing his focus to the most kissable lips on the planet. It was like the woman knew exactly how she affected him. "You're pretty incredible too," she said as she took a sip of her drink. "Oh." She stuck her tongue out. "Gross." "What?" "It's actual champagne." Bryce grumbled. Why would anyone hand her that? Everyone knew she didn't drink. And he didn't drink either once he found out why. He took a sip. "Mine is too." Victoria shook her head. "I'm so sorry." "Let me fix that." Bryce held up a hand. "Oh, no, it's okay. I'll take care of it." He smiled. "Are you sure?" Victoria asked. "I don't mind. I mean, you two are my star team." "Nah, I've got it." Savannah touched his arm. "Oh, it's okay. I don't have to toast. Besides, it's over now. That just means we get our own toast." He took her glass and winked. "I'll be back in a second." Bryce weaved around the gathered employees until he reached the drinks. Victoria had been pretty good about getting sparkling juice for Savannah ever since it was learned that she didn't drink. Sure enough, there was a bottle of the stuff on the table, unopened. He set their glasses down and worked to get the bottle open. "Hey, congratulations on landing another client," Cliff said as he sidled up next to Bryce. He glanced at Cliff. "Thanks. Someone gave Savannah real champagne?" Bryce nodded. "Yeah, and I have no idea why." "You really should ask her out," Cliff said. Not again. We've discussed this. It's not happening." Cliff lifted an eyebrow. "Right. It's not like you're good enough for her anyway." Bryce finished twisting the bottle top off. "I never said I wasn't good enough. We make a good team. Why mess it up? So, what you're saying is that you're so inept that you'd ruin everything." "I never said that either. Quit putting words in my mouth." "Then why would you mess it up? What if she turned out to be the love of your life?" "Right." He was pretty sure she was the love of his life, but he also knew how much she loved her career. Bryce loved his too. They were magic together, and he didn't want a new partner if things went south. "It's not worth it." "How about a bet?" "A what?" "A bet. You ask her out." "That's ridiculous." "I'm not asking her out. I'll match what you gave to the community center." Cliff smirked. Bryce's jaw dropped. The guy pinched his pennies like Mr. Krabs, but matching Bryce's donation? Wow. He could almost hear those pennies screaming for freedom from the locked box at Cliff's home. The center's roof would be fixed, along with several other repairs they needed. But asking Savannah out because of a bet? That thought soured his stomach. "I don't know." "Okay, I'll double it." "Double it?" Holy smokes. All the repairs done, plus enough left over to get a real athletics program going, one with uniforms and equipment that worked all the time. Something they'd wanted for years. Still, a bet. Could he actually ask Savannah out, knowing he was only doing it because he was fulfilling a bet? Would she hate him? Would she understand after he explained why and that it was to help the center, something she knew was near and dear to his heart? "Okay, I'll do it." Cliff grinned. "Awesome. 3 dates between now and Christmas, and to win it, you have to kiss her under the mistletoe at the company Christmas Eve party. And not just a small peck on the cheek. A real kiss. And if I don't?" His friend's eyebrows threaded together, and his gaze dipped to the floor. Cliff was thinking too hard, and that made Bryce nervous. "You have to babysit for me and Michelle every Friday night for the next 6 months." Bryce chuckled. "I love Hayden and Franklin. That's not really an incentive to win." "Yeah, But even you have your limits, and this way, I win whether you win or lose. You win? Cliff set his hand on Bryce's shoulder. My best friend's happiness is a win. A lump formed in Bryce's throat, and he nodded. Thanks, he choked out. He poured himself and Savannah some juice. I need to get back. Yeah, I know. You have a date to make. Bryce took a deep breath and turned in the direction Savannah was standing. His nerves seemed to come alive with the prospect of asking her out. How exactly was he going to do it? Just blurt it out, or did he need to practice in the mirror first like a big old dork? However it happened, life was about to change, and he wasn't sure he was up for it.
I'm so sorry about the alcohol, Victoria said yet again. I should have been more aware. Savannah loved that her boss was caring. It made working for her easy. Was it really a job when a person loved what they did and who they were working for? Really, it's okay. Victoria smiled. Usually Bryce is the one to drink first, but you beat him this time. What an odd thing to say, but it was true. Typically, Bryce would taste drinks first because more than once, during client parties or whatnot, Savannah would be served alcohol and they'd come up with a system. Even at the office, he'd taste drinks first because it was such a habit. She just didn't think anyone had noticed. Oh, well, it's fine. Gail walked up and clinked her glass with Victoria's. These two are amazing, aren't they? They really are, Victoria said, pride peppering the words. You know, you two really do make a great team. You work so well together. I'm surprised you aren't dating, to be honest. Well, you know, we're such a good team. We wouldn't want to mess that up. We respect you too much. Savannah smiled. Victoria lifted an eyebrow and exchanged a look with Gail. Well, I appreciate that. Her gaze swept the room. Oh, I need to speak with Walt about the gaming keyboard campaign. I'll see you bright and early on Monday. Gail waited until Victoria was gone. You and Bryce have been partners for a year, and I've seen the way you two look at each other. If the sparks were flying any faster, the building would be in flames. Heat crept up Savannah's neck. Spark, she squeaked and cleared her throat. There's no sparks. Please. Gail crossed her arms over her chest. Take a chance. Ask him out. You two are such professionals that I know you'd work it out and you'd be fine no matter what happened. Oh, no, we couldn't do that. How about a bet? Savannah blinked. A what? A bet. You ask him out and go on 3 dates between now and the office Christmas Eve party, and you win by giving him a real kiss under the mistletoe. Gail, I don't know. It'll be fine. It's not like everyone in the office can't see it. Think of this as a friendly little push. What happens if I lose? Gail shrugged. I get to set you up another date.
Oh no.
Not after what happened with the last setup. The thought of getting stuck with another Paul Peterman was enough to get her to dive naked into a frozen pond. Besides, who would Gail choose this time? And if I win? She asked. Aside from having your hunky partner get a promotion to boyfriend? Savannah sighed. As if that would happen. Yes. I'll do the coffee run until summer. No traipsing out in the freezing snow. This was silly. All she had to do was say no, and that's exactly what she was going to do. Okay. Wait. What? That totally wasn't what she meant to say. Gail clapped her hands together in excitement. Okay, the bet starts tonight. Wait, I meant to say. Her hand came up. Nope, you agreed. It's a done deal. 3 dates and a kiss. You've got 2 weeks. Savannah's mouth could make the Sahara look like an Amazon rainforest. She turned and caught Bryce's gaze as he was walking toward her. How was she ever going to get the nerve to ask him out? Could she gather enough courage? On a good day, her middle name was Chicken. What had she gotten herself into? Chapter 5. Savannah wiped her hands down the sides of her slacks as Bryce approached and stopped in front of her. If she wasn't struggling before, she was now. 3 dates with Bryce? He handed her one of the glasses he was carrying. Okay, I personally poured it, and I know it's safe. Thanks. Holding up his glass, he said. A toast to the best partner a guy could ask for. Their glasses clinked as he tapped his against hers. You really are the best. I'm only the best because you're my partner. We make a great team. If only they could be more, but risking his friendship and their success seemed stupid. It made her think about her first job right out of college. She'd had a great partner, and they'd dated too. It had turned into a nightmare, and she hated the thought that the same thing could happen to her and Bryce.
Yeah,
We do. He sighed as he held her gaze, and something unreadable flashed in his eyes. Was this it? Was she supposed to ask him out now? Why did it feel like her mouth didn't want to work all of a sudden? Are you keeping with tradition this Christmas and spending it with your sister and then going to the community center? This was part of the reason she liked Bryce so much. Not only did he love his family, but he loved giving back. He was a genuinely nice guy, and wrapped that heart into the deliciously attractive package he was, and it was a wonder she didn't turn into a puddle. He nodded.
yeah,
Why break with tradition? Are you still excited about your Puerto Rico trip? Well, I'm just not going. She gasped. He'd been planning the vacation for a year. What? Why? The community center needs a new roof, and with funds being so low, they didn't have enough to cover the deductible. The building inspector was going to shut them down right before Christmas if they didn't get it fixed. Her respect for him swelled. And you gave them the money you'd been saving? You already give so much. I know, but without that building, the homeless won't get to eat on Christmas. The kids will be without somewhere to go after school. Puerto Rico will be there later. It was more important than a trip. She laid her hand on Bryce's arm. You're such a good man. He cleared his throat. Savannah, Hey, you too. Victoria nearly collided with Savannah. I just got a call from Simon. He loves your ideas so much that he wants you to come up with a Christmas campaign. Bryce shrugged. Oh, well, of course, we can come up with something by next year. Victoria shook her head. No, he wants something this year. Savannah gasped. This year? There's not enough time. He says he wants something simple. There are 2 weeks until Christmas, and I told him you could have something within the week and the commercial finished before Christmas. Bryce coughed. You what? We're good, but we need more than a week, Savannah said. How was she supposed to go on 3 dates with Bryce by the Christmas party if she was working for half of it? I know you can do it. Victoria smiled. You're my star team. Savannah palmed her forehead. Okay. I guess. Bryce's hand came to rest on the small of Savannah's back, and she lifted her gaze to his. He smiled, and her anxiety melted. We can do this. She nodded. We can do this. It's not that late. Why don't we go have dinner and talk strategy? Like a business date? He grinned. Exactly. Yes. She nearly fist-pumped the air. 1 date down, 2 to go. Gail didn't say they couldn't be working dates. Sure. How about Zambelos? Italian works for me. You know that. Victoria put one hand on each of their arms. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you. You can count on us, Bryce said. Victoria gave them one last smile and left. Savannah choked. 2 weeks from concept to finished commercial? Bryce grunted. I mean, I'm glad she has so much faith in us, but this is cutting it really close. Let's go grab dinner, and we'll brainstorm. Okay. They'd done this very thing more times than Savannah could count, but going with the knowledge that she was counting it as a real date made her all sorts nervous and freaked out. Great. I'll get our coats. Wanna call and make a last-minute reservation? She nodded. Sure. He walked away as she pulled her phone out of her pocket. A date, no, a working date with Bryce. Working. As long as she remembered to put that in the front and center of her mind, she'd be great. It wasn't a big deal anyway. It was a silly crush because they were together so much. She was making something out of nothing.
Good food, great conversation, and the most beautiful woman in the world. Bryce couldn't have asked for a better first date. Well, working date, but that was a technicality. Technically, she didn't know he was considering it a real date. He only hoped Cliff would. The community center needed that money. Oh, I'm stuffed, but a full stomach means a fed brain, Savannah said. Bryce rubbed his stomach. Yeah, me too. Maybe we shouldn't have ordered 2 appetizers and the spaghetti for 2 with the extra bread. My brain doesn't feel fed. It feels sleepy. Savannah chuckled. Will we ever learn? Probably not. The food here is way too good. Even though they ate there at least once a week, it never got old. Plus, I think there might be an addictive element in the sauce. She tipped her head back and laughed. That laugh. Light and sweet, and he could picture loving it until he was 80. You're probably right, she said as she caught his gaze. I guess we should discuss the pending campaign. What are we going to do? He shrugged. I have no idea. Maybe we could do something like this? His eyes widened as he sat forward. Yeah. We could have one of their shareable pastries sitting in the middle of the table. The camera pans out, and the voiceover says, Christmas is a time of sharing, not only stories and laughter, but good food. Merry Christmas from Simon's family to yours. Savannah's eyes twinkled. I love it. Simple Simon with a simple campaign. See. You're the brilliant one. Nope. I only piggyback on your brilliance. At least we didn't have to struggle to come up with something. We can write up the storyboards early tomorrow and present it to Simon via video conference. That'll give us 4 days to shoot the commercial and get it edited and ready to go. How about instead of writing it up tomorrow morning, we go back to my place and write it up tonight? That way we can conference with Simon tomorrow morning. If he doesn't approve, that gives us time to come up with something else. She nodded. Yeah, you're right. Your brilliance is showing again. Bryce rolled his eyes. It's not a competition. Yeah, but if it was, you'd win. I would not. With a laugh, she said, would too. We'll call it a tie. Fine. I couldn't be tied with a better person. Savannah coughed. I mean, you know. He knew what she meant, which was why he'd hesitated to ask her out. I know. We make a great team. Something flashed in her eyes, and she nodded. Exactly. Why did that feel like such an arrow to the heart? They were just friends, and he wasn't brave enough to let her know this was a real date. What did he expect? Would she even be open to seeing where they could take things? Again, that would take courage on his part, and she was Savannah Hayes. In his opinion, there wasn't a woman alive that could compete with her. Bryce didn't think he was a bad guy, but Savannah? She was so out of his league. How would he ever gather enough gumption to ask her out for real? And what was he going to do? Especially with the community center on the line? Maybe he'd have a little more courage at home. How about we get out of here and get those storyboards lined up? She smiled. May as well get them done. He's on the West Coast. If we get them drawn up quickly enough, maybe we can pitch it tonight. Good idea, he said as he waved down the waiter. The more time the better. Yeah, he'd get home, they'd work a while, and in the meantime, he'd psych himself up to ask her out and hope she didn't laugh at him.
Chapter 6. And when the camera pans out, you've got this family eating your cinnamon rolls. The commercial ends with a Merry Christmas, from Simple Simon's family to yours, Bryce said. After getting the storyboards drawn up, Savannah and Bryce had finished with just enough time that they felt comfortable conferencing with Victoria and Simon on a call, hopefully making a pitch that knocked some socks off. Now, all they needed was approval. Simon templed his fingers in front his mouth and leaned back on what looked like the plushest couch Savannah had ever seen. The guy was a waif, and he was sinking into it. Minute after minute ticked by until he nodded. I love it. Simple, easy, and organic, just like our baked goods. Victoria's eyes lit up. I knew they could do it. They always do. I'm sorry it was so last minute, but this is incredible. Thank you. Simon smiled. Savannah glanced at Bryce and then back to the screen. I'm just glad we came up with something so quickly. We'll get production scheduled as quickly as possible so we have time to edit. It'll be ready in time to run for Christmas. Bryce nodded. We'll start getting things set up tonight. I've got a couple of friends who are directors, and I trust them to wow you. That's great. I'll leave it to you, Simon said. I'd love to continue talking, but my little girls are waiting for Daddy to read them a bedtime story. Yes, sir. Thank you for taking our call. He tipped his head and ended the call. The second he was gone, Victoria clapped her hands together. That was awesome, and now I need to go. Teresa and John brought the baby over, and I'm babysitting while they go out to dinner. Sure, I think we're going to make a few calls and get some stuff set up for tomorrow, Savannah said. Bryce smiled. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Go enjoy your grandson. Night, guys. Victoria returned his smile. He ended the call and turned to Savannah. Well, we did it again. Yes, and notice the use of we? Because it takes both of us. His lips curved up further. Maybe. Now that they weren't furiously working to get the storyboards done, Savannah could do nothing but think of the bet she'd made with Gail. When Bryce had suggested dinner, she thought she'd have a second to ask him out then, but her chicken factor had been at an all-time high. Then they'd finished their meal and went to his home, giving her another opportunity to ask him. The very thought made it feel like the butterflies in her stomach had doubled. Okay, before we start making calls, how about something to drink and maybe a snack? Maybe a little fuel will help me wake up, he said as he stood. She nodded as she looked up at him. Sure. Bryce held her gaze a moment and then palmed his forehead. Savannah, I need to tell you something. Okay. I hope you won't hate me, but I wanted to ask you out. Her heart soared. He was asking her out? Maybe there was truth to what Gail had said. Maybe Bryce did have feelings for her. Oh, well. Cliff bet me to take you out, and if I did, he'd match my donation to the community center if we went out 3 times before Christmas, Anne. Oh. And just like that, her heart hit the floor with a messy thud. A bet? She wanted to be furious, but for one, she knew how much he loved the community center where he coached kids during their after-school program. And two, hadn't Gail bet her? How was that any different? At least Bryce's reasons were noble. Still, part of her had wanted so much for him to be asking her out because he wanted to, but no such luck. He quickly sat beside her and took her hand. I'm so sorry, but I wanted. She pulled her hand free and put it up to stop him, not wanting to hear the apology again. No, it's totally okay. The center needs the money, and I'd be selfish not to help. I'd be happy to go out with you. But... Bryce, she said, cutting him off again. Really? It's okay. He shook his head. You don't. She quickly stood, needing to put some distance between them, and cast a glance over her shoulder as she went to the kitchen to grab them drinks. "We're all good. I completely understand, and I'm game. We're partners. Of course I'm going to back you up. You'd do the same for me." A small smile spread on his lips.
Yeah.
"You would. Thanks." She stopped in front of the fridge and pulled the door open, letting the cool air drift over her face. There was nothing on earth that could soothe her heart. She cared so much for him, and working with him while knowing that he only thought of her as a coworker was going to test her ability to maintain her professionalism. Besides, she only thought of him as a coworker too. The only reason she'd even entertained the idea was because of Gail's influence. She didn't think of him like that, and the feeling was obviously mutual.
Chapter 7. Bryce pinched the bridge of his nose as he hunched over the boardroom table with the phone to his ear as he spoke with Morgan Wood, their go-to director. Sweet Savannah was on a coffee run for them since they'd agreed to meet early to get the commercial set up. Hopefully it would help him refocus and get his mind off of asking her out the night before. Asking Savannah out had taken every ounce of courage he'd mustered, and she was only going out with him so he could win the bet with Cliff. When he tried to explain more about the bet, she'd shut him down. They were co-workers. Why couldn't Cliff have listened? Bryce told him there was nothing between them. That she didn't see him like that, and now there was concrete proof. She was only going out with him to help the community center and nothing else. Actually, she'd let him down easy by not allowing him to sound like a desperate idiot, especially when she wasn't interested in him. "Bryce?" Morgan called through the phone. Shaking his head, Bryce said, "Yeah, I'm here. Just stayed up too late and got up much too early." Add to that the sleepless wallowing, and, well, the bags under his eyes were what prompted the coffee run. "So, I'll get it cast by the end of this week. I've got people in mind already, and I've worked with them before. I think they'll be perfect for the shoot. You got a location for me?" "No, but I will. Give me a location nailed down, and we can start shooting as early as next week." He paused. "That sounds great, man. I knew you were the one to call. Want me and Savannah on site when you start?" "Yeah, it wouldn't be the same without you two there." He laughed. "All right, I'll let her know. See you then. Bright and early, dude." "Yeah." Bryce groaned and hung up the phone. He leaned forward with his arms on the table. He was so glad they weren't shooting until next week. Maybe by then he'd have his thoughts nice and tidy. Laying his head on his arm, he closed his eyes and let out a slow breath as he relaxed. A power nap was just what the doctor ordered. "Bryce, the coffee's going to get cold." It felt like seconds had passed as he sat up, yawning. "I'm not sure it'll matter." He lifted his head, and as tired as he was, his heart sped up as they locked eyes. Savannah sat in the chair next to him, setting the coffee down as she did. "What's got you so tired?" As if he could tell her the truth. "Oh, just thinking about getting this commercial done." "You've never been worried before." "Well, we've never had to do one this quickly." She shrugged. "True, but it looks like we're going to pull it off." "Looks so. Morgan thinks he has a cast in mind, and we can start shooting next week." With a laugh, she pushed his coffee closer and said, "Well, we do have things under control. You could take a day off, you know?" He shook his head. "No, we need to scout a location." "Seems my head isn't here either," she said and yawned. "I'm tired too." "Why are you tired?" Her cheeks turned light pink, and she shrugged. I think this shoot has me worried too." He wanted to press her because something didn't ring true about that, but he wasn't her boyfriend, and that wasn't his place. "I think you're right. We've got this. Let's drink our coffee, and we'll get out of here and look for a location. We could use that farmhouse just outside of town. The one we used about 6 months ago?" Bryce smiled as he remembered finding it the first time. They'd actually gotten lost and stumbled across it. It had turned out to be perfect. Plus, the sweet old lady who owned it had needed the money. That works. I really like Mrs. Tully. She was a sweet lady. We'll go see her and see if she's okay with us shooting there again. That works for me. I'm driving, though. I can drive. Savannah chuckled. No, you can't. I hit a bush one time, and now I can't drive? It wasn't a bush, it was a tree. And you have a tendency to get tired when you drive. This way, you can sneak in a power nap on the way. He scoffed. Fine. You can drive, but I'm not falling asleep. She lifted a single eyebrow. 20 says you don't last 5 minutes. Narrowing his eyes, he said, You're on. It wasn't until he stopped to think about it that he realized what he'd just done. He'd bet $20 he wouldn't fall asleep. As tired as he was, he needed to stop by a teller on the way out of town because she was so winning this bet. 5 minutes? More like he wouldn't last 5 seconds. Maybe he could gracefully step back and get out of it. Don't even try to back out of it, Savannah said. He jerked his gaze to hers. What? I know that look. It's the look that says, I did a dumb thing, and now I need to find a way out. It is not. Could she really read him that easily? She laughed. I've worked with you for a year, and that is your signature oops look. He rubbed his mouth with his hand as he smiled. I have an oops look. With a nod, she sipped her coffee, her sparkling bright eyes looking at him over the rim of the cup. Did she know how sultry that was? How much it made him want to pull her into his arms and kiss her. Heat crept up his neck, and he swallowed hard. These were thoughts he shouldn't be having about his coworker and partner. He cleared his throat and gulped down a swig of coffee, hoping to mask the blush rushing up his face. Okay, guess we should get going. I'm ready when you are. She smiled. If he was going to survive a car ride with her, he'd need to lose that bet on purpose. A nap would keep him from talking to her, which, as of the last couple of days, seemed to be near impossible with the way his thoughts were going. Maybe it was time to move on from Victoria's firm. Bryce wanted more than work and the community center. No, he needed more than that. He needed love and someone to love. If that wasn't going to be Savannah, he needed space to get over her and find someone else. Letting her go would be difficult, but he'd find a way to do it.
Chapter 8. Stealing a glance, Savannah checked on Bryce as he slept in the passenger seat of her Ford Explorer. She'd been right, of course, and he'd lasted all of 5 minutes. It was a good thing he'd fallen asleep, too. She'd had no idea how she was going to survive the hour-long car ride with him. He was so cute, and she'd been so heartbroken the night before. All night, she'd been unable to sleep, worrying and wondering how she was going to continue working with him when he didn't see her as anything but a coworker. Being the sweet man he was, he tried to explain Cliff's bet and how he had to ask her out, like it was a chore to be on a date with her. Not a chore, she was sure he didn't see her like that, but it had hit her so hard, and she'd hurt so bad after realizing he'd never see her as more than a partner at work. By the time the sun was coming up that morning, she'd made up her mind that she would put in her resignation at the first of the year. Working with Bryce was no longer an option. She cared about him too much, and it was too painful to know nothing would ever come of it. The best thing for her was a clean break. A flash of a house caught her attention, and she slowed. Hey, she said and shook Bryce. We're here. He locked his fingers together and stretched them out. Yawning, he said, that power nap wasn't nearly powerful enough. Savannah chuckled. Better than nothing, and you owe me 20. I know. As she pulled the car to a stop, she took in her surroundings. It was so nice to get out of the city. The countryside of Tennessee was breathtaking all the time, and in the snow, it was better than a picture. Mrs. Tully's home sat atop a hill with trees everywhere. The 2-story centuries-old home was incredible, and Savannah could imagine having a house full of kids running around, bounding down the stairs. The only thing it was missing was a Christmas tree centered inside the front window. There's no Christmas tree, Bryce said, seeming to read her mind. Wonder why? With his hand on the door handle, he caught her gaze and smiled. Let's go ask. He pushed out and stood. She followed him out and gaped at the snow-covered area. It looked completely different in winter. So clean and fresh. Not that it wasn't in summer with its rolling green hills, but there was something about snow that made everything feel new. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. He glanced over his shoulder. Can't you just picture living here? Raising a family? It would be amazing. The commute into Nashville would be long, but it would be a pretty drive. He set his hands on his hips. I think I'd talk Victoria into letting me work from home. Savannah couldn't believe her ears. It was as though they were sharing a brain. You'd really leave the city altogether? What about the community center?
Yeah.
Didn't quite think that through. But I only volunteer there twice a week, so I could make it work. It sounded like they were making real plans, but that was wishful thinking. She shivered. The snow was pretty to look at, but, boy, was it cold. Let's get inside before I freeze. Okay. They walked to the front door, and Bryce knocked. Hold on, I'm comin', I thought. Mrs. Tully's muffled voice carried through the door. A moment later, it swished open, and her mouth popped open. Bryce and Savannah. Long time no see. She gathered Bryce and then Savannah into a hug and said, Come in. I just put a kettle on the stove. They stepped inside, and Bryce shut the door behind them. Hey, Mrs. Tully, you're as beautiful as ever. She shook her knobby finger at him. Oh, you sweet talker. I'm old as Moses. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? He grinned.
Yeah.
But sounds like you need your eyes checked. Savannah snickered. Mrs. Tully, it's so good to see you. It's good to see you too. I take it you need the house again, she asked as they stopped in the kitchen. Take a seat at the table. Yes, ma'am, Bryce said. It's just so perfect. The woman smiled, and the warmth of it filled the room. Bryce held Savannah's chair as she sat before taking a seat next to her. It wouldn't be as long as last time, but because it's such short notice, we could pay the same. Mrs. Tully sat across from them, leaning forward on her arms. Well, ain't like I've got a ton of people beating my door down. Is that same feller, Morgan, gonna be shooting it? Yes, ma'am, Savannah said. He's our go-to on shoots like this. I'm okay with that. The little feller was sure sweet, and I think he had a hollow leg with as many cookies as he ate. Mrs. Tully laughed. Bryce nodded.
Yeah.
You spoiled us. You know you don't have to do that. She waved him off. Oh, I don't mind. I enjoy cooking for people, and now that it's just me, it gives me an excuse to do it. Well, we aren't complaining, even though it took me a month to get off that 10 pounds I gained. I now know why it's called pound cake. Savannah chuckled. I'll be more careful this time. Bryce bumped her shoulder with his. Don't listen to her. She gained nothing, and if she did, it only made her more beautiful. Mrs. Tully's gaze flicked from Bryce to Savannah. I see. The kettle whistled, and Savannah jumped up. I'll get it. You don't know what I was making. Mrs. Tully turned in her seat and eyed her, a mischievous grin playing on her lips. She turned back around. Bryce, you think you could do me a favor while you two are here? He nodded. Absolutely. I've got a Christmas tree in the attic. I'm just too old to get up there and get it down. You think you could fetch it and the decorations for me? Mrs. Tully asked. Oh, you bet. We wondered why there was no tree, so I'd be happy to do it. Savannah's hands shook as she took the kettle off the stove. This felt like a setup. Thank you. I appreciate that. Mrs. Tully smiled. Bryce stood. I'll be back shortly. He slipped his suit coat off and folded it over the back of the chair before leaving the kitchen. Mrs. Tully turned to Savannah as soon as he was gone. I think you and I need to talk. Yep, a setup. Were you making tea or coffee or? Oh, how about some hot chocolate, and you tell me why you and that young man aren't together yet? Savannah whipped around. What? Mrs. Tully rolled her eyes. I'm old, not blind. That boy's in love with you. Wishful thinking. Oh, no, he's not. We're just coworkers. You can't fool me. You're in love with him too. Why not just get it out in the open? Once Savannah had the hot chocolate fixed, she brought the mugs to the table and took her seat again. It's not like that. She went on to tell Mrs. Tully about the bet. How he'd only wanted to ask her out so Cliff would have to donate to the community center. And he's such a good guy that, of course, he'd tell me because that's just who he is, and he loves that center. I don't think he could have passed on it, even if he tried, especially since I knew how badly they needed a roof. Do you like him? Like him? Understatement of the year, but Savannah wasn't about to let that thought pirouette through her mind, much less say it aloud. Mrs. Tully. Do you like him? Her tone was a little more forceful. Yes, but we've only done work stuff together. Nothing we do is ever just us having fun. Mrs. Tully grinned. Honey, men are dumb. You're going to have to help him see what's right in front of his face. With a shrug, Savannah asked, how? Well, you say he only asked you out for a bet. Make him earn it by taking you on real dates. Flirt, darling. Bat those lashes, look deep in his eyes, and let those baby blues sparkle. Mrs. Tully patted her hand. And it's Christmas. If the two of you are out, you suddenly remember you have to get a gift for poor old Aunt Mildred. I don't have an Aunt Mildred. Does he know that? Suddenly, Savannah's brain was catching up. So, I need to be proactive? Take charge and find things outside of work? Exactly. Savannah chewed her lip. He does coach at the community center. I've shown up before. Of course, it was work-related, but it doesn't have to be. Right? Mrs. Tully nodded. Now you're catching on. So what if it's a bet? Turn it into what you want. You want a shot with him? Then take it. Nothing spells regret like chances not taken. Savannah's mind was whirling with ideas. Mrs. Tully was right. Just because it was a bet didn't mean anything. You're right. If I want him, I need to go for it. That's my girl. With a chuckle, Mrs. Tully winked. Savannah had felt so defeated the night before, but now a whole new mindset was taking over. So what if it was a bet? He'd still be asking her out. Just because he thought of it as a bet didn't mean she had to. And while they'd spent much of their time together in a work-related fashion, it didn't mean that's how it had to be all the time. It was time she took her love life into her own hands. If Bryce couldn't see that they were perfect for each other, then she'd just have to do what it took to open his eyes.
Chapter 9. Bryce stopped as he reached the attic on the third floor and let his gaze sweep around the room. Old furniture, antiques, knickknacks, and all sorts of things in between were everywhere. A sad little fake tree sat in the corner closest to him. With a few long strides, he was standing in front of it, grimacing. Mrs. Tully wanted that in her front window? There was no way he could do that. Even if they weren't shooting a commercial the next week, he liked her too much to stick her with that ugly thing. Nope, it wouldn't do. Stooping, he slid off the top of one of the boxes sitting next to the tree. It was filled with a tree skirt that looked quilted, a star, and some ribbon. He checked a few more boxes, and those were filled with ornaments and tinsel. They'd work, and he could envision them on a live tree parked smack dab in the middle of the old farmhouse's front window. It would be awesome. He put the lids back on the boxes, stacked 2 of them, and headed down the steps. A chuckle filtered from the kitchen, and he smiled. More than likely, Savannah was charming Mrs. Tully. Not like it was hard for Savannah either. She was just naturally so. Of course, Bryce was biased too. After setting the boxes down in the living room close to the front window, he strode to the kitchen and stopped just inside the door. "Mrs. Tully, would you be offended if I offered to buy you a live tree?" Savannah turned, and his breath caught as she smiled. What's wrong with her fake tree? Work, brain, work. Well, there's a branch missing, and it's a little sad. Mrs. Tully looked at him. I can afford a tree. I just haven't bothered since it's just me, and the fake is easier for me to handle. Bryce walked the rest of the way into the kitchen and stopped at the table. I'm here. Why not use me? He rolled his sleeves up. If getting his hands dirty was what he needed to do to convince her to have a live tree, he'd do it. I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. He laughed. Mrs. Tully nodded. Well, a smart woman never turns down the help of an attractive man. So, I'd say you're hired. Attractive? His ears grew hot. Well, he knew he wasn't ugly, but he'd never thought of himself as very attractive, especially with his crooked smile. Well, why don't I start with the tree? That way, you and Savannah can work on decorating it while I do whatever else needs to be done around here. There's a tree lot about 5 miles north of here in a little one-stop sign town. He's a friend of mine and a small businessman. Would you mind getting it from there? Mrs. Tully asked. Sure, I'll go right now, Bryce said as he picked up his suit coat. I won't take long. Mrs. Tully stood. Savannah, why don't you tag along with him? In situations like these, a man needs a woman's eye for detail. Standing, Savannah gave Mrs. Tully a grin. I totally agree. Something was going on, but Bryce didn't have a clue as to what. More than likely it was woman stuff, and he'd learned long ago that it was best to avoid the entanglements that kind of stuff brought. That sounds great. We'll be back shortly. Once they were in the car with Savannah behind the wheel, they headed back down the long driveway to the main road. It was a short few miles to the tree farm since most of the drive there was filled with talk of trees and the kind they should get. At the farm, Savannah parked the car, and they exited. There were far more trees than Bryce had envisioned when Mrs. Tully said small. Wow. This place smells like Christmas. Savannah's twinkling blues caught his as she turned to him. I love it. I'll have to get my tree from here from now on. Yeah, me too. It's great. He walked to the back of the car and pulled out a thicker coat for him and Savannah and handed one to her as he returned. Good thing we keep these in the truck just in case. She slipped her coat on and nodded. Yeah, we'd be freezing by the time we picked a tree out. There are so many, he said as he put his coat on and zipped it up. Right? She said small. I think our definitions aren't exactly matching. Bryce chuckled. Yeah. Just then, an elderly gentleman with a cane waddled over to them. Hello. Need help with a tree? Yeah, Mrs. Tully sent us to get her one. That was mostly true. Bryce had suggested, and she'd pointed in this direction. Name's Truman Osgood, the man said as he stuck out his hand. Bryce shook his hand and smiled. I'm Bryce Foster, and this is my friend Savannah Hayes. He waved toward her. Truman shook her hand. Well, it's good to have pretty friends. Savannah's cheeks turned the cutest shade of red. Thank you. She stuffed her hands in her coat pockets. I think we need about a 10-foot tree. Bryce nodded. For an old farmhouse, the living room had high ceilings, as though Mrs. Tully and her husband had pictured having large trees in there. Yep, sounds about right. Truman pointed to the far corner of the lot. Well, my 10-footers are over there. I separate them by height, shorter to taller. Go have a look, and when you've picked one, tie this yellow ribbon on it. He pulled a ribbon from his pants pocket and handed it to Bryce. I'll have my 2 sons load it up and deliver it. Won't take but about an hour or so. An hour or so? Not great, but better that than them trying to drive back with it strapped to the hood of the car. Sounds great. Okay, take your time. Ain't no reason to hurry out here. The man tipped his head and walked away. Bryce turned to Savannah. You ready? Nodding, she began walking to the back corner lot. I love this. The tree farm? Yeah, well, not just the farm. The country. Being in Nashville is great, don't get me wrong. She twisted to look at him as they walked. But there's something so peaceful about the pace of life out here. It feels like home. Yeah, like home. She sighed. He pointed ahead. Oh, hey, that's what we're looking for. Savannah gasped. A Leland Cypress. I've always wanted one of those. She dashed forward and stopped, touching the branches of the tree with an awe he'd never seen before. It's so pretty. I don't know that I've ever seen one. They're not hugely popular because they don't smell as strong, or that's what the guy who owned the tree farm in Nashville said. Now, I have a feeling he was feeding me bologna. So you've already got your tree? Bryce asked, hoping the answer was no. He'd love to surprise her with one of these. She shook her head. No, after walking the lot for an hour, I gave up. I'd get one from here, but I don't think it would make the trip strapped to the hood of the car, and I don't want it ruined. Oh, she was so having a Leland Cypress for Christmas, even if it meant spending a fortune to have it delivered, only she'd have no idea. Savannah loved surprises, and he'd get to really surprise her like he wanted. Inside, he was excited at the prospect of seeing her face light up like never before. Is this one good? Can you hold it for me so I can make sure? He nodded and pulled it away from the trees it was leaned against. Enough room? Yep, she said, stepping back and eyeing the tree from top to bottom before walking around it. Circumference is good. It's all symmetrical. It's not dry. She stopped and looked over the remaining tall cypresses. Yeah, I think so. I'm surprised we picked the very first one, but it's perfect. I can just see all the ornaments and lights. It's going to be so pretty. She quickly tied the yellow ribbon on one of the branches. They locked eyes as he smiled. He could picture a life with her. A good 60 or 70 years of picking out Leland cypresses. This tree has nothing on you. She rolled her eyes and walked to him. You're such a flatterer. Savannah, you are without a doubt the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. That's not flattery. That's fact. The tree slipped from his grip and began to pitch forward. He grabbed Savannah around the waist and hauled her out of the way as it crashed to the ground. Wow. That was close. No kidding. A 10-foot tree would have squished me. Or, well, scraped me up pretty good. As she lifted her gaze, she smiled, her eyes twinkling, and those plump pink lips of hers were so close. Bryce swallowed hard. Yeah. She slipped her arms around his neck, and his heart skipped a beat. His head screamed, "Coworker," and his heart threatened to shut it up with duct tape. Thanks for the save. Did her voice get lower? Why was she being all flirty? Did she even realize what she was doing? It was Savannah. She was so unaware of her beauty that it was possible she was completely oblivious to just how sexy she was. No problem. Had his voice gone lower too? He wasn't trying to be anything but himself, but, heaven have mercy, she was a breath away. He needed to let go of her, to step back, but his brain was malfunctioning. Her floral scent, soft-looking lips, and, was she batting her lashes? No, she wasn't that way. He was having a mental breakdown. You know, you haven't asked me out on that second date. Her lips curved up, and his pulse ticked faster. Well, you know, I just thought you might need a minute after finding out about the bet. It was freezing, but beads of sweat were trickling down his back. She lowered her arms and nodded. Right. Well, I understand why you do it. The community center means a lot to you. But dinner last night wasn't a date. Cliff said you had to ask me out and we had to go on 3 dates, right? Yeah, but now that you know, we don't have to do that. Why did he say that? He wanted to go on a date with her, but after the way she freaked out the night before, he was too unsure to even try to broach the subject of them being more. Not for real, at least. Something flashed in her eyes, and her smile faltered a fraction of a second. I know, but I want you to win the bet. Should he tell her to win the bet he had to kiss her under the mistletoe? He tried the night before, but she'd cut him off, and the prospect of getting to kiss her made the decision so difficult. He wanted to kiss her. Had wanted to kiss her. Maybe if he kissed her, he could show her just how much she meant to him. He could try making the date special, but he and Suave had an ongoing feud, and every time he tried to be smooth, he failed. When it came to moves, he was a chessboard without pieces. I do want to win. So, see? You'll ask me out, I'll say yes, and when Cliff asks, you can be honest. That way, you and the community center win. Okay. She clasped her hands in front of her and blinked as she smiled. What are you doing? Waiting for you to ask me out. It was a total brain freeze. Why? She was going to say yes, and there he was, deer in a headlight. He raked his hand through his hair. Okay. Savannah, would you like to go out with me tomorrow? Rocking back and forth on her heels, she squeaked with laughter. Why, Bryce, I'd simply love to. She was going to be the death of him. Both heart and body. With a shiver, he shook his head and sighed. Are you ready to get back to Mrs. Tully's house? I'm freezing. With a nod, she stepped forward and hooked her arm in his. I'm ready. Even through his coat, the warmth of her hand spread through him. If only she could see him as more than just her coworker, but again, the thought of losing her devastated him. Did he risk showing her how he felt if it meant not having her at all? That's what would happen if he resigned anyway. At the moment, parts of him were too frozen to think. Hopefully, by the time he picked her up for their date, he'd have an answer.
Chapter 10. Savannah draped a strand of tinsel on the tree. It had come a lot quicker than Mr. Osgood said it would, and it was even better looking in the house than she'd expected. While the scent wasn't strong, it was good enough for her. Plus, it was so full and picture perfect. It would look fantastic for the commercial. Marcus would be over the moon. When I sent you two for a tree, I never expected something like this, Mrs. Tully said as she stepped back, folding her arms over her chest. It's just plumb beautiful. Joining her, Savannah nodded.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. It had to cost a fortune. Not like Savannah had any idea. Bryce paid for it and wouldn't let her see the price, going so far as to make her go to the car so she didn't overhear. Of course, if he wanted, he could write off the expense, but knowing him, he'd done it at his own expense because Mrs. Tully's little fake tree wasn't up to snuff. No clue, but whatever it was worth every penny. It's flat out spectacular. Did you or Bryce pick it? Me. Mrs. Tully touched her arm. Honey, you did great. I couldn't have picked better if I'd tried.
Aww.
Thank you. I'm so glad you like it. It's not the typical fir. That's what I like most about it. That pine smell can get overwhelming, but the scent is so light that it's more like a hint of something in the air. Savannah nodded. When I was researching them, the website I was on said that people with allergies do well with these trees because of that. I'm not allergic, I just like the look of the tree. You've made a convert out of me. I don't know if I can go back to that fake tree now. Are you okay, financially, Mrs. Tully? I'm not trying to pry, but you were so nice to us last year and now this year. If you need anything, I'd like to help. The elderly woman patted her cheek. Oh, sweetheart, no, I'm okay. The reason I used the fake tree was because my kids are grown, and last year, I visited them in Jacksonville. The fake tree was mostly for me, and I didn't need anything fancy. With a nod, Savannah smiled. Okay, but you'd tell us if there was, right? I mean, I know we aren't family or anything, but Bryce and I really like you. Okay, I'm done with the kitchen sink, Bryce said. The two women turned at the same time, and Savannah snickered. Got a little dirty, huh? He was too funny. His shirt and slacks were wrinkled from his time spent under the sink, and dirt streaked his face. The towel he was wiping his hands on barely had any clean spots left. I never said I wasn't messy. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Tully. And I've already cleaned up. Anything else you need me to do? No, I don't think so, and you really didn't have to mess with that. It was just a little leak, Mrs. Tully replied. And now there are 0 leaks and you don't have to worry about it. He winked. Thank you, dear. I appreciate that. Savannah walked to him and, taking the rag from his hand, pulled him with her as she called, "We'll be right back, Mrs. Tully." She stopped at the sink and washed out the rag before turning to him and dabbing at his face. It was nice of you to do this for her. She's sweet, and all her kids live out of state. And you're a good guy. More than just a good guy. He was a great guy. Always going out of his way to help people. Even if it meant destroying his expensive clothing. He shrugged. I try. You more than try. She moved closer as she wiped his face, and if she leaned forward a fraction, her lips would be touching his. Her heart thrummed in her ears, and her mouth went dry. He was so cute and sweet, and she'd never wanted to kiss anyone so much in her life. I can't, Mrs. Tully said. Oh, I'm sorry. The spell broke so quickly that Savannah felt slapped. No, it's okay. Bryce stepped back, seeming to look as out of sorts as she was. I think we should get going if there's nothing else you need. We'll leave the contract with you and be back on Monday to start the shoot. That is, if you agree to the terms. Mrs. Tully nodded. I'm sure they'll be fine, but I'll read over it. If I have any questions, I'll give you a call. Savannah took a deep breath and painted on a smile. The moment was lost, but it was okay. She was going out with him tomorrow. There would be another moment.
Yeah.
I need to get home. Bryce stepped around Savannah. Well, he said, holding his arms out and looking down at his clothes, I need a shower and some clean clothes. Mrs. Tully snickered. I'd offer my shower, but the clothes, I'm afraid you'd be stuck with a towel. Savannah's cheeks heated with the mental image. She needed some fresh air. At the moment, it would take a mile trek in 4 feet of snow to cool her off.
Yeah.
I guess we do need to get back. He bumped her with his shoulder. I can drive. She rolled her eyes. No way. And he thought he didn't have any charm. Mrs. Tully was right. Savannah needed to bring her at a game tomorrow when he picked her up for their date, and she would, too. It would be completely out of her comfort zone, but he was worth it. The doorbell ringing pulled Savannah from her dream. Why couldn't they have waited until after he kissed me, she grumbled as she shoved the covers off and stood. Stupid doorbell. Who was at her door so early on a Saturday morning? She stomped down the steps to the first floor of her townhome and whipped the door open. Her eyes widened as she came face to face with Bryce dressed in jeans with a t-shirt showing under his puffy hooded coat, looking as cute as ever. Hi, she said. Crud. Her hair was a mess, she was pretty sure drool was dried on the side of her mouth, and, oh, double crud, no bra. She crossed her arms over her chest and smiled. What are you doing here? And as if he hadn't noticed her disheveled appearance, he swept his arm to a truck in front of her home. I thought you'd like a Leland Cypress for your Christmas tree. He smiled. Tears pooled in her eyes. "You got this for me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I could see how much you loved it, and I convinced Mr. Osgood that you needed one of his trees." She threw her arms around his neck and squeezed. "This is the nicest, sweetest thing anyone has ever done for me." She leaned back. "I love it." His arms circled around her. "You haven't seen it yet." "I don't have to. I know we have a date tonight, but I had to see your face when you saw it. I know how much you love surprises, Anne. It's the best." And she'd think there was more to it if it weren't for the fact that this was just a part of what made Bryce, Bryce. He did this kind of thing. Like surprising his entire basketball team with new shoes or taking the entire office out for dinner. Or better, bringing dinner to the cleaning crew. She only knew that because she stayed late one night and overheard them talking. Bryce was a flat-out wonderful man. His cheeks rose as his smile widened, the crooked tooth in front showing. "I'm glad you're so excited. This means you'll have to stay and help me decorate it." He nodded. "I was hoping you'd ask. I even brought donuts." She hugged him again. "You're the best partner in the world." It was almost imperceptible, but she felt him stiffen, which was odd. It was probably just her imagination, though. "You are too." "Where you do want it?" asked one of the guys who'd brought the tree. Savannah dropped her arms from around Bryce's neck. She hadn't heard them on the steps, and her cheeks burned. "Right this way." How was it that the world could fall away so fast when she was with him? But that's how it always seemed. Completely alone or a room full of people, being with him made it easy to forget anyone else was around. Once she was dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and most definitely a bra, they got the tree in place in her living room. Savannah pulled out her boxes of decorations, and they began hanging them on the tree. It was so much more fun when she had someone helping her. She'd always loved this time of year. Right after the Christmas Eve party, she'd be going home to spend the holiday with her mom, dad, sisters, and their husbands, and nieces and nephews. She'd thought about inviting Bryce since he didn't have any family, but she'd hesitated because she was sure how he'd react to it. Of course, he'd be appreciative, but since they'd never spent time together like that, she'd never been brave enough to ask. Meeting the parents was something people who were dating did. With the last ornament placed, they both stepped back. "Oh, it's just gorgeous. Makes me wish I could take it home with me," Savannah said. "I bet you're excited to see your family." She turned to him. "I really am. I flew out to see Jennifer, Mark, and the baby, and I've been getting pictures and stuff, but I can't wait to hold my baby niece again. She was so cute." "Aren't all babies cute?" "She's my niece. She's the cutest baby ever." "Well, all of my nieces and nephews are cute. And you spoil them like any good aunt." She nodded. "Of course, that's what aunts are for." Bryce smiled. "Did you get the email from Victoria?" "No, I woke up when you rang my doorbell." With a grimace, he said, "Oh, sorry. I thought you'd be up. You brought me a tree. You're totally forgiven." "What about the email?" "Since Christmas falls during the week this year, she's giving us the whole week off, starting after the party, which has been moved to the Friday before." Savannah's eyes widened. Talk about a Christmas miracle. I mean, Vic is sweet, but she's also a workaholic. Has she ever given the office the entire week off? "I started a little before you, but if the rumor is true, the answer is no. I'll need to thank her. As soon as the party is over, I'm flying to New Mexico." Bryce lifted an eyebrow. "New Mexico?" She grinned.
Yeah.
"The entire family is meeting in Ruidoso and having Christmas there. We've rented a huge cabin, and we're all staying there. We're determined to have a white Christmas this year."
Yeah.
"I guess Florida isn't going to get you a ton of snow. What are you doing for Christmas this year?" Maybe she could ask him to join her. There'd be plenty of room for him, and her family wouldn't mind. He shrugged, scratching the back of his neck. I think I'm going to pass out gifts to my basketball team, and I might volunteer to help with Christmas dinner at the community center. Oh, well, you could come to New Mexico with me. My family is a firm believer in the more the merrier, and we'd love to have you. Thanks. I'll think about it, but in the meantime, it also means our Simon's shoot is moved up. We need to get it done, to the editors, and present it to Simon by that Friday morning. She raked a hand through her hair. That's less than a week to get everything done. I know. Have you called Morgan? He nodded.
Yeah.
As soon as I got the email, I got on the phone with him. Everything is a go. We're to be at the farmhouse at 6 in the morning, tomorrow. Aside from getting the tree delivered this morning, I was on the phone with Mrs. Tully to make sure it was okay. Morgan sent me a text as I got here to let me know the cast is good to go too. Wow, you're really on the ball. I didn't want to drop that news on you and then have both of us scrambling. Plus, I know you like sleeping in on the weekends if you can. I was up early anyway. He was so sweet. Thanks. I'm going to go, and I'll see you tonight for our date. With the timeline changed, that meant their 3 dates would have to be crammed together too. She touched his arm. Our dates. We're going to have to get on the ball if you're going to win that bet. I didn't want to bring it up, but
Yeah.
tonight counts as one. He shot her a half smile. I was hoping to ask you on the second after our first tonight. Maybe ask for the third after that. Oh, she said, heat rushing to her cheeks. That makes sense. Do I need to dress any special way? You don't have to take me anywhere fancy. Taking a deep breath, he locked eyes with her. Anything you wear looks great on you. Thanks, but I don't want to wear jeans when I should be wearing a dress. How about you wear whatever you want, and we'll stroll around downtown until we find something we like. It was just like him to do something casual, which she liked. Okay. Will you let me drive? Maybe. She laughed. He pulled his phone out and looked at it. Oh. Gotta go. The game is in a couple of hours, and some of the kids wanted to practice. Better get going, then. I'll see you. 7, he asked as he walked to the door. She nodded. Okay. As he opened the door, he turned and said, I'll see you tonight. Tonight. Or sooner if she decided to go to the game, but she really wanted to look great, and she needed to find a dress to wow him. As soon as he shut the door, she began counting. When she got to 20, she squealed with excitement. She'd wanted to make sure he didn't hear her sounding like a schoolgirl just getting off the phone with her crush. The date was going to be awesome. It would be the two of them, alone and on a real date. That had to make things feel different. Make him see her differently. They could be more than partners at the firm. She just knew it.
Chapter 11. After stalling on the sidewalk for an embarrassing amount of time, Bryce rubbed his sweaty palms down his pants as he took the steps to Savannah's townhome. He had no idea why he was so nervous to pick her up. It wasn't like he hadn't done it before. Who was he kidding? He knew exactly why. It was a date. A real date with Savannah. Something he'd been dreaming about from almost the second he'd met her. Now it was happening, and he was nothing but raw nerves. What if it was a disaster? What if all this time he was playing up being with her and there was nothing there? Talk about a ridiculous thought. He was in love with her. He gulped as the realization hit him. He loved her. From her eyes to her bubbly personality to the way she laughed. He loved everything about her. Life was just better when she was around. Part of him wanted to just blurt it out and see where the cards landed, but the more logical, rational part of his brain said to cool his jets. See how the date went. He hadn't even kissed her yet. If he didn't get his chance tonight, he would at the Christmas party at the end of the week. The door swung open, startling him. Whoa! What are you doing just standing out here? If it wasn't for the nosy old lady across the street, I wouldn't have known you were here, but she said a man was lurking on my front porch. Lurking? I'm not lurking. What could he say? That he was debating his future with her and planning it out, having not even taken her out on a single date yet? Savannah chuckled. I know. I suspect the second you stepped in front of my house, she was calling me. Oh. Good thing she called you and not the cops. Believe me, that was her next call. You ready? Or do you need a minute? I'm ready, she said, grabbing her coat from just inside the door. He held it as she slipped it on, and then she shut and locked her door behind her. So, do you know what you're in the mood for? I think you should get to pick. She caught her bottom lip between her teeth and grinned, the dimple on her right cheek deepening. Maybe something will smell good to both of us, and we can go from there. Sounds like a plan. They walked to his car and got in. As he drove, they chatted about her family. It had been really sweet for her to invite him to Christmas, but he didn't want to intrude. And as much as she'd say he wasn't, he'd feel like he was. When they arrived downtown, he found a parking garage and parked the car, taking note of where he parked for later. As they hit the street out front, they paused. Which direction? He asked. She shrugged and looked both ways. Left. Left it is. It hadn't felt like a date at all until that second. He was on an actual date with her, and he had no idea how to act. How long had it been since he'd been on a date? That was pretty easy to pinpoint. Not long after he was paired with Savannah. Of course, he'd gone out on dates at first, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd be sitting across the table from a beautiful, intelligent woman, and all he could do was wish it was Savannah. When he realized that was happening with every date, he'd stopped asking anyone out. She was who he wanted, so why even try? It's cold, she said with a shiver. Yeah, maybe a walk downtown was a bad idea. Sorry. I'm cold, but this is nice. He nodded. Yeah, it is. And do you smell that? Sucking in a lungful of air, he smiled. Oh yeah. Barbecue. She smiled. I'm thinking ribs with so much sauce we can drink it. Bryce laughed. Sounds good to me. They walked a block and ducked inside the restaurant, ordering at the counter before finding a booth near the front window. Savannah stuck their number in the holder on the table and shucked her coat as Bryce did the same. Wow. It's warm in here, he said. Yeah, like an oven. I think I'll have a new appreciation for the cold when we're finished eating. No kidding. She leaned forward with her arms on the table. I kinda like this. Me too. It's weird not talking about work, though. It was so strange to be with Savannah and it not being work-related. Not bad, just different. Awkward, maybe? She eyed him a second before slipping out of her side of the booth and sitting next to him. Now it feels like a date. That's right. It was a real date, and he'd promised himself that he'd treat it as such. He put his arm around her shoulders. No, now it feels like a date. Cliff would totally be shocked, wouldn't he? Floyd is more like it. Yeah, he would. May as well act like it's a real date, right? She smiled. Act? She was acting? His stomach took a nosedive, hitting the ground with a splat. The barbecue had smelled mouth-watering when they walked in, and now his stomach was turning. Yeah, I guess so. He felt gut-punched. So, about Christmas. I was totally serious earlier today. Why don't you come with me? Even if he'd considered it before, he wouldn't now. Spending an entire week trapped with Savannah, knowing he loved her and that she didn't feel the same way? He'd be ashes by the time he got home. He took his arm from around her. I've volunteered for the kitchen at the community center, and they're counting on me. It was a total lie. Actually, it wasn't. He'd volunteered, and strangely enough, they had plenty of help this year. His Christmas would be free and clear, minus the gifts for the kids, which he could give them at any time. Oh, okay. Well, if you change your mind, the invitation is there. You're more than welcome. Thanks. Their food arrived, and they continued to chat through dinner. Bryce mostly picked at his. Even as great as the food tasted, his heart hurt. Just when he'd mustered enough courage to treat the date like it was a real one, she had to go and say she was acting. Are you okay? She asked, pulling him from his thoughts. Yeah, I'm fine. You're not eating. She lifted her gaze to his, and he couldn't stop himself from chuckling. A tiny bit of sauce was stuck to the corner of her lips. Even knowing she was acting, there was still the urge to kiss it away. He touched the corner of his mouth. You've got some sauce there. Oh. She dabbed at it, missing most of it. He took the napkin from her hand. Here. He touched it to her lips, wiping the sauce off, and as if he were having an out-of-body experience, he leaned forward and touched his lips to hers. Soft, warm, and wholly wonderful. More so than he could have ever imagined. A jolt went through him, hitting him square in the heart. He loved her with everything in him. Leaning back, their gazes locked for the briefest of seconds before their lips touched again. Her arms circled his neck as he pulled her closer. He'd never been one to kiss in public, at least not like this, but he didn't care. Did she feel it? Their connection? The kind that lasts forever? One that saw children, grandchildren, and hundreds of sunsets spent together as they cuddled on the back porch? He certainly did. But she wasn't seeing that, and kissing her only made him want her more. Breaking the kiss, he leaned back. Real dates come with kissing, right? She blinked, and something he couldn't put a finger on flashed in her eyes. Slowly, she nodded, dropping her arms from his neck. Yeah, they do. What did you want to do after this? Savannah took a drink of her soda. I don't know. We have to be at the farmhouse pretty early, so I'm guessing we don't want to stay out too late. Don't want to be zombies while filming. Morgan would kill us. True. It sounded like she was ready for the date to be over now. He hated how weird things felt, and it was his fault. He'd kissed her, knowing that she was only going out with him to help him with the bet. How did he squash the awkwardness hanging in the air? Maybe it was best to pretend the kiss didn't happen, even if that was the last thing he wanted to do. It's only 8. Maybe we could just walk around a little more, and then I could take you home. Sure. Do you want me to pick you up tomorrow morning? Do I get a choice? He laughed. She shook her head. No. You and early mornings are not what I consider safe driving conditions. I nodded once. Just once. Everyone has done it at least once, and I was sitting at a stoplight, so it wasn't even like I was actually driving. She lifted her chin. Still, I'm driving. Fine. He took a bite of his rib and set it back down. There was no way he was eating the rest of his meal. Not when he felt so sick to his stomach. I think I'm going to get a to-go box. You sure you're feeling okay? You've never eaten so little. I'm okay. I think I'm worried about the shoot tomorrow. I'm hoping we can finish it in a day so we have plenty of time for editing and then letting Simon see it. If he wants any changes, we have time to do them. Savannah nodded. Yeah, I'm hoping so too. Morgan's good, though, and if anyone can get it done, it's him. I'm just glad he was able to change his schedule so quickly. Me too. I'll be glad to see Mrs. Tully again. Yeah, I really like her. Maybe I'll see if I can take her out for Christmas if she's staying in town. So she doesn't have to be alone. She touched his arm. You're so great. Yeah, great, but not great enough to be seen as anything of significance to her. Nothing more than a partner or maybe friend. Suddenly, the idea of walking around downtown didn't appeal to him at all. He held his stomach. You know, I'm not feeling so good. I think I should get home and go to bed so I'm feeling better in the morning. As if he'd get any sleep whatsoever. Not only would he be feeling sorry for himself, but he'd be trying to come up with ways to get out of the bet. He couldn't imagine going on 2 more dates with her. Then again, it wasn't just about them. It was about the community center, and Bryce knew Cliff well enough that there was no way he'd cancel the bet. Nope, he was stuck. Stuck loving the woman who would never be his.
Chapter 12. Wiping her eyes for the 100th time, Savannah took a deep breath as she pulled up to Bryce's apartment. The second she'd stepped inside her townhome the night before, she cried a bucket of tears and she struggled to stem the tide. He hadn't even asked her on a second date. She'd been flirting when she'd made the remark about acting, but then he'd said real dates come with kissing. He'd been the one acting. It hadn't felt like he was when he was kissing her. It was a small kiss, just one on the lips, but it had rocked her world. And now, she'd have to go through life wondering what a real kiss with him would be like. The door to her car opened, and Bryce jumped in. "It's freezing out there." "That's what 4 in the morning gets you." She sniffed. "Are you feeling okay?" Nodding, she said,
Yeah,
"I think that walk last night kicked up my sinuses, but I'm fine." "Are you?" "You were the one with a sick stomach last night."
yeah,
"I'm good." He turned in the seat. "You sure you're okay, though?" "That sounds kinda rough." She held in a snort. "Rough?" "More like brutal." She'd batted her lashes, flirted, and come away with disappointment. All she wanted was to find Mrs. Tully and talk to her about what happened and hopefully get some advice on what to do next. Was there a next, though? It was pretty clear to Savannah that she and Bryce were never going to be. "Oh,
yeah,
I've taken some allergy medicine. Once it kicks in, I'll be as good as new." "Okay. I could drive if you wanted." "I've had coffee, so I should be okay." He laughed. Savannah shot him a glance.
nah,
"I got it." They sat in companionable silence until they reached Mrs. Tully's. It was already a madhouse with Morgan and his crew. Trucks, cameramen, cast, and there was Mrs. Tully on the front porch in her overstuffed jacket with a cup in her hand. How the woman could stand out in the freezing cold was beyond Savannah. Touching the handle, Bryce pushed open the door, and a gust of frigid wind hit her. "Okay, I didn't dress near warm enough if we're going to be outside much," she said. "If they need someone outside, I'll step in." They got out of the car and walked to the porch, both shoving their hands in their pockets as they did. When they reached Mrs. Tully, she held up her mug. "Want some coffee?" "I've got plenty." Savannah nodded. "I'll take a gallon. Maybe I can bathe in it and get warm." Bryce gave Mrs. Tully a side hug and smiled. "How are you this morning?" "I'm good. Ready to get this show on the road. I have the contract sitting on the table. Did you want a cup of coffee too, Bryce?" Morgan stopped next to Bryce. "Hey, man, I need you." Bryce nodded to Mrs. Tully. "Yes, but in a minute. I'll see you two inside." He trotted off with Morgan to one of the trucks. Savannah followed Mrs. Tully inside to the kitchen and took a seat at the table. She shivered hard and let out a breath. "Man, it's cold." "It is, but I have a feeling you've got something on your mind." "I went on a date with Bryce, but it was a disaster." Mrs. Tully fixed Savannah a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. As Savannah poured in a little sugar and cream, she told Mrs. Tully all about the date and the kiss. "Well, honey, you're the one who said you should act like you're on a date. Maybe he thought you were saying that because you didn't want him to think you were interested in him like that," Mrs. Tully said. Savannah hadn't thought about it like that, but it was possible she'd given him the wrong impression. She was trying to flirt, but between work and not being interested in anyone but Bryce, she didn't have many chances to practice. "I guess, but I was flirting." Surely he had to know that. Men aren't the brightest bulbs. Sometimes we have to nudge a little to get them to open their eyes. "I see the way he looks at you. I know he doesn't think of you as just a coworker or even a friend. That man is in love with you. Savannah waved her off. No. He's just sweet. Sweet my tushy. That man is sweet on you. It's just a bet, Mrs. Tully. We wouldn't have gone out if it weren't for that. He was trying to win the bet. By kissing you? What man kisses a woman when he doesn't want to? No, there's something there. You mark my word. I'll eat my shoes if he's not in love with you. Oh, if he was in love with her, she'd be on cloud 9. Then the word she'd used smacked her in the heart. That's why she'd been so devastated by the night before. She was in love with him. From his crooked smile to his generous heart and everything in between. She loved him. Touching her hand to her heart, she smiled. It was a revelation that gave her such a feeling of peace that she could float on a cloud. Mrs. Tully pointed a finger at Savannah. And you love him too. He didn't even ask me on a second date. You said he wasn't feeling good. Maybe he didn't want to make a date and then have to cancel it because he was sick. Savannah cast her gaze to the table as she thought about it. That was true. He'd been sick to his stomach. What if he was thinking he might not be able to follow through on the date and didn't want to have to back out? The least she could do was give him the benefit of the doubt. Okay, but I only have 2 dates left, and the company Christmas party is Friday. We have so much work between now and then. So, just because you don't call it a date, doesn't mean it isn't one. And you don't have to be on a date to have fun with someone. Haul him up the hill and go sledding. Pretend to trip and let him catch you. Haven't you ever seen a Hallmark movie? There are some of the clumsiest people on earth in those movies. Always trippin', slippin', and bumpin' into each other. Savannah snorted.
Yeah.
I've seen them. I have that channel on nearly all the time when I'm at home. I like their movies. All right then. Take your cue from one of those movies. Get the guy, girly. Maybe if the shoot goes well, we can do something tonight. Mrs. Tully winked. That's my girl. We're gonna get that boy yet. She clinked her cup with Savannah's. Savannah sure wished she had Mrs. Tully's confidence. Although, the talk had helped considerably. She no longer felt hopeless like she had since Bryce dropped her off the night before. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe she did need to borrow from the Hallmark playbook and trip into his arms. Shooting took all morning and most of the evening. When Morgan finally called it a wrap, Savannah could have danced with joy. She'd been crossing her fingers the whole day, hoping she'd get to spend some time with Bryce and use the suggestion Mrs. Tully had given her, actually taking him sledding. Morgan stopped in the kitchen where Bryce, Savannah, and Mrs. Tully sat, drinking some hot chocolate. Okay, everyone is packed up, and I'm headed out. I'll drop off the filming with the editors on the way home. You sure you don't want to stay for some hot chocolate? Asked Mrs. Tully. The director smiled. No, ma'am. I promised my little boy I'd take him to the movies tonight, and I need to get home. See you later, Morgan, Bryce said. See you guys later. He smiled and left. I really like that young man. Bryce nodded.
Yeah.
That's why I like to use him. He's a really great guy. Treats his cast and crew with respect. Just an all-around good guy. They sat quietly a moment, Savannah's leg bouncing under the table, trying to figure out when to ask Bryce to go sledding with her. Before she could gather some bravery, Mrs. Tully eyed her and smiled. You know, you two should go sledding. Have a little fun celebration for a job well done today, Mrs. Tully said. Bryce blinked. Sledding. Wow, I haven't done that in years. It's really cold, though, and Savannah's allergies were already giving her trouble this morning. Savannah waved him off. Actually, that sounds like a ton of fun and worth whatever suffering I'll have to endure. There are sleds in the barn. Help yourselves. Mrs. Tully finished her drink and stood. I'll get the fire stoked for when you get back. Trust me, you'll need some good old-fashioned fireplace warmth when you're done. Bryce stood and pulled out his gloves. Okay. I'm game if you are. Pushing out of her chair, Savannah stood next to him, slipping her coat and gloves on. I'm glad I wore jeans today, but I may be wishing I'd worn long underwear too. No joke, but it'll be fun. They headed out the barn, picked up the sleds, and trekked up the hill. Savannah plopped down on hers. First one to the bottom wins. Not fair. Bryce called as she took off. A moment later, she could sense he was gaining on her, and she leaned forward, hoping to keep her lead. Seconds later, she skidded to a stop just as Bryce stopped next to her. I win. It's a tie, he said. Is not. 2 out of 3? She scooped up a handful of snow, formed a ball, and threw it at him. Sore loser. Chuckling, he said, I'm a sore loser? You're a sore winner. Let's go again. Fine. He stood and snatched up his sled. You had a head start last time. She grabbed her sled as she faced him. I'll still win. He narrowed his eyes. Will not. Will too. After you. He waved his hand to the hill. They trekked up the hill again and shoved off at the same time. Bryce beat her by a hair, and they went again. He did say 2 out of 3, and there was no way she was letting him win. She squealed with laughter as the sled flew down. Despite her best efforts, though, Bryce hit the bottom before her. At the last second, she aimed her sled toward his and crashed into him, throwing them both to the snowy ground. They lay there a second, shoulder to shoulder, laughing. It was way more fun than she thought it would be. It probably had more to do with who was with her. I haven't laughed like that in what seems forever. He rolled to his side and leaned over her with his elbow in the snow. These gloves are doing nothing to keep my hands from freezing. She nodded, loving the feel of him next to her. I know. They're a little wimpy. You kind of have a snow angel thing going on. We could make some. She smiled, wishing he'd make a move and kiss her. Then again, she was the one who was an idiot and said she was acting like they were on a date when that wasn't how she meant it at all. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I don't think we should stay out any longer. Not with you having allergies. Your eyes were really red this morning. I don't want you to feel bad later. A little frosty air isn't going to kill me. But not having Bryce in her life might. She wanted to wake up to that smile and those warm eyes. She wanted him so much. Without another thought, she lifted on her elbows and touched her lips to his. They felt incredible. Soft, warm, and so expertly fit hers. She pulled back just a breath and locked eyes with him. For a second, she worried she'd upset him, but he touched his lips to hers, pressing her back into the snow. Another brush of his lips across hers, and she was circling her arms around his neck, holding him to her. With the third touch, he deepened the kiss, and her heart pounded as her pulse raced. This was the kiss she'd been dreaming of and not giving it justice. It was so much better than anything she could have imagined. She could spend 100 years being kissed by him, and it wouldn't be enough. Too soon, the kiss ended. When Bryce leaned back, he held such a pained expression, and she realized she'd made a huge mistake. He hadn't wanted her to kiss him. She needed to fix this and quick. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me, Bryce. He opened and shut his mouth a few times before nodding. It's okay. I kissed you back, and I took it too far. I guess I was caught up in the moment. Caught up in the moment? That was the worst thing he could have said. But was it really any worse than sorry? No. Bryce stood and held his hand out to her. Let's get inside and get warmed up. Then we can head back to Nashville. She took his hand and let him pull her up. As they returned the sleds, Savannah's heart felt as if it had been torn to shreds. The man she loved didn't love her back. There was no way she could continue to work with him. Not when she wanted to be with him. The only way she was going to manage getting over him was to get some distance. At the Christmas party, she'd be handing Victoria her resignation.
Chapter 13. It had been 4 days since Bryce kissed Savannah back, and the awkward tension hadn't dissipated even an ounce. No matter what he did or how much he apologized, it didn't seem to make any difference. In fact, it seemed to make it worse. Holding his head in his hand as he sat at his desk, the numbers on the paper in front of him blurred as, yet again, he felt himself being pulled back to that moment when they'd kissed in the snow. It had been beyond amazing. Mind-blowing even. It had been the best kiss he'd ever had. He couldn't even fathom kissing another woman anymore. All he wanted was Savannah. A knock came at the door, cutting through his thoughts. He lifted his head and said, "Come in." The door opened, and Cliff stepped inside. "Hey, man." "Hey. I hear Simon loved the commercial." "Yep, Savannah and I showed it to him a few hours ago." Victoria was thrilled. As soon as the video call ended, she was nearly dancing in her seat. "I bet," Cliff said as he strode to the chair in front of Bryce's desk. "And Saturday parties tomorrow. You ready to kiss Savannah under the mistletoe?" If Cliff only knew, but there was no way Bryce was telling him. "Does it matter? I didn't get to finish the dates." "Yeah, but neither of us expected Victoria to give us an entire week off. You did ask her out on a proper date." Bryce knitted his eyebrows together. "How do you know that?" Cliff's eyebrows reached his hairline. "Are you kidding?" "Savannah probably told Gail. The whole office knows." Groaning, Bryce put his head in his hands. The office was filled with gossips as plenty as paperclips. "Just what I need. Look, just kiss her under the mistletoe and that money is as good as donated. At best, she sees me as a friend and nothing more. I promise you." Cliff shook his head. "No way. She's totally into you, and you feel the same way. You've read it all wrong. Trust me. She's just sweet, and it's her personality." "Do you really believe that? Like, deep down in your heart truly believe that?" Cliff leaned forward. "Because your lips might be saying that, but that's not the vibe you're sending." Bryce's shoulders sagged. "I'm in love with her, and I think it'll crush me to work with her and know I'll never get to be with her. But she was clear that night I took her out. She was just acting." "And the kiss they'd shared in the snow?" She'd apologized for it, and, like an idiot, he'd backtracked, saying it was just the heat of the moment when it wasn't that at all. If he could have, he would have spent hours kissing her. "Have you told her how you feel?" "No. I can't. Besides, what's the point when I know she doesn't feel the same way?" Cliff sighed. "The point is that it would be out. She'd know, and you could talk about it. Stop assuming things and just be honest with her. And let her tap dance on my heart. It already feels ripped out. Look, it's scary telling someone you love them, but what if you've been reading all of this wrong and she feels the same way? Wouldn't you want to know?" Of course he'd want to know. "I'm not reading any of it wrong. You didn't see her face or hear her tone. She's Savannah and sweet. She wasn't trying to crush him. It had just happened because he'd been foolish enough to fall in love with her, even when he knew she didn't feel the same way." Cliff leaned back. "Okay, then I'm making it part of the bet. You weren't able to do the 3 dates, but you can tell her how you feel." Bryce's heart thundered in his chest. "No, don't do that. Why can't you trust me? I know she doesn't feel that way about me. And you need to know for sure. While you've just admitted to being in love with her, you've felt this way for a long time. You need to have it out in the open. It's the only way you'll be able to continue working together. I could just say I told her." Cliff lifted an eyebrow. I've known you too long. You can't lie to save your life. He stood and walked to the door. You tell her how you feel and kiss her under the mistletoe or vice versa. I'm not picky about the order. I really hate you sometimes. Cliff smiled. Yeah, but you're my best friend. I have to look out for you, even when you aren't looking out for yourself. With that, he left. Bryce slid down in his chair and let his arms hang over the sides. He didn't want to make a mockery of men on death row, but that's really how he felt. Like a man heading down a path that led to more heartbreak than he could handle. Now, he just needed to decide how much he loved the community center and if he was willing to fulfill the bet.
Chapter 14. It was only a few minutes before the party would start as Savannah knocked on Victoria's office door with a shaky hand. She thought she'd found enough nerve to get through the evening, but the second she'd stepped inside the office building, it had scattered like mice. The last 5 days with Bryce had been awkward and awful. Knowing she loved him, knowing he didn't love her. Being lost in that snowy kiss every spare second, she wasn't focused on something else, and even then, it seemed to plague her. She couldn't get away from it. Finally, she'd sat down at her computer and typed her resignation. The heaviness of her decision lay across her shoulders, concrete blanket style. She knocked again before hearing Victoria tell her to come in. Her boss smiled and stood as Savannah entered and shut the door. "Hi," Savannah said. "Hey, Savannah. Is everything okay? The party will start any minute, and I've made sure they know you only get non-alcoholic anything." Savannah smiled at the thoughtfulness. "Thanks, but she handed Victoria the piece of paper she was holding. Victoria held her gaze as she held the paper, and then her eyes dipped to the page. With a gasp, she locked eyes with Savannah again. "Resignation? Why? I think my time here has come to a close. I've loved working here and with you, but I just can't continue." "But..." Savannah held her hand up. "It was nothing you did. I think you're the best boss I could ever ask for. It's just time for me to move on." Victoria slowly sat in her large leather desk chair. "Does Bryce know?" No, Savannah was going to tell him last. Maybe he'd even appreciate the fact that she was leaving, given how tense and weird things had become since they'd kissed. "And I'd like to tell him before you announce it." Victoria nodded. A knock at the door pulled their attention to it. Gail poked her head in. "All we need is the boss to kick off the party. You guys go ahead and start." "I'll be right there," Victoria said. Gail nodded, and the door clicked shut. Savannah smiled. "Come on, boss. It's time to celebrate." Victoria looked up at her. "I don't much feel like celebrating at the moment." "I know, but it's for the best, and I'm sure you'll find someone just as good to replace me." "There's no one that can replace you, but I'll respect your decision." "Thank you." Savannah really was lucky to have Victoria as a boss. It made the idea of looking for another job daunting. They left Victoria's office, walking in silence to the large conference room. Savannah looked around at the people she called friends and wished things could be different. That she could be stronger and stay. Bryce stopped next to Savannah, handing her and Victoria a champagne flute. "I made sure this time that there was no alcohol." Savannah nodded. "Thanks." Victoria set the bottom of the glass on her flattened palm and cleared her throat. Everyone quieted, and she took a deep breath. "I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work this year. You've all done incredible jobs. I couldn't ask for a better group of people to work with." She lifted her glass. "Merry Christmas, everyone." Bryce clinked his glass with Savannah's and took a drink. Instead of taking a sip, she took his glass, set it down on a nearby table, and pulled him to the open doorway. Her heart ached when she noticed the mistletoe was hanging there. How ironic. "Bryce, I need to tell you something." "Is everything okay?" She wrung her hands as she kept her gaze on the floor. I handed in my resignation just now. What? He nearly yelled. The room quieted, and she lifted her gaze to his. His face had paled. You handed in your resignation? She nodded. I just think it's for the best. You can't resign, he said, not seeming to care that every eye was on them. Savannah. He raked his hand through his hair. Savannah, I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you since a half second after I met you. I know you don't feel the same way, but I can't let you leave without knowing that. Her pulse jumped as she looked at him in stunned silence. Did he love her? But, you love me?
Yeah.
I do, and I should have just told you, but you were always going out with different guys, and then you kept saying how much you loved working with me. You only see me as a friend. A tiny laugh escaped her throat. Bryce, the reason I was leaving was because I'm in love with you, and I couldn't spend another second working with you knowing you didn't feel the same. What? I'm in love with you too. I have been. I thought you only saw me as a coworker. That you couldn't see me as more. That's the only reason I let Gail set me up on those stupid dates. I didn't even want to go on them. He stepped closer. But you were just acting like we were on a date.
Yeah.
And I kissed you, and you looked like you'd kissed a skunk. She placed the flat of her hand against his chest. Because I thought you didn't want me kissing you. His hand covered hers as he took another step closer. Holding his gaze, she smiled and palmed her forehead. This is so crazy. Bryce wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against him and looked up at the mistletoe above them. To win the bet, I have to kiss you under the mistletoe. He looked back down. But you have to know that I'm not kissing you because of that stupid sprig. I'm kissing you because I can't picture my life without you. There is no one else but you. There never has been, and there never will be. I don't want anyone but you either. That last word had barely left her lips before he was kissing her. An incredible toe-curling, hair-raising, spine-tingling kiss that turned her insides to
Go.
and made her glad he was holding her. Their audience erupted in cheers, and they broke their kiss, looking around. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Victoria clapped. Finally. Cliff nodded as he stopped next to her.
Yeah.
No kidding. I have a feeling you were all in on this, Savannah said. Gail looked from Cliff to Victoria. We were all in on it. We've all been trying to push you two together. We could only take so many stolen glances and moony-eyed stares. We all donated to the bet fund. Bryce cupped Savannah's cheek, bringing her gaze to his. I guess we owe them thanks. She shrugged. That, and the mistletoe bet. I love you. Circling her arms around his neck, she'd never felt more content in her life. I love you with all of my heart.
Epilogue. 6 months later. Bryce tugged on his coat for the millionth time as he stood at the front of the church. Once he'd confessed to being in love with Savannah, she'd insisted on him coming to Christmas with her, where he'd taken the opportunity to ask her to marry him. Since then, they'd been in a flurry of wedding plans. Stop yanking on that, or you'll never get your deposit back, Cliff said. I'm getting married. I think I have a right to be a little antsy. Only, he wasn't really antsy, just ready to be married to the woman he loved. You're not having cold feet, are you? Bryce scoffed. No, but this is still nerve-wracking. Cliff placed a hand on his shoulder. Relax, man. You're marrying the girl of your dreams. Yeah, I am. Bryce took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as the church music began to play. The doors opened, and Savannah came into view. Whatever he'd been feeling a moment before was gone, and all he could see was her. He'd always thought she was drop-dead gorgeous, but today she was beyond gorgeous. She was a vision of pure love and light to him. He wiped his eyes with his hand and bit back a surge of emotion as she continued forward. No, he didn't have cold feet. He was more than ready for Savannah to be his and to start their life together in the house they purchased from Mrs. Tully 2 weeks prior. They'd be working from home, their home, and starting a life together filled with happiness and contentment. This has been The Mistletoe Game by Bree Livingston. Copyright 2018.